back, everybody. This is going to be another fantastic, exciting, totally unrehearsed intro outro that we do every week. We do have an idea of what we're trying to do, but I am Morgan Ryan, one of your hosts of the show, here literally with my partner in crime, the one, the only, the Tennessee hillbilly who went to West Virginia and now ran to Florida.
There you go. And I'm cross between a redneck and a hillbilly. And this is Murph, Steve Murphy here, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, Murph's a product of reincarnation. If you
I saw that. That was funny.
gotta take a look at our Facebook page. Well, hey guys, you all welcome back. This is going to be again we got a fantastic guest, an interesting one too coming up. So hey, we just the script says I'm supposed to do housekeeping, which I just did. Some Apple review stuff. Here we go. Apple, Spotify, just go out and give us those 5 stars. We really appreciate it when you guys do that. Really helps us out a lot. And really, we enjoy the comments, so please keep those things coming. Also, head on over to our website. You're going to want to do it for this one because the guy that we got coming up doesn't have 1, doesn't have 2, doesn't have 3 books. He got a shit ton of books.
Oh, yeah. What's that, 7?
So I lost count after 94. So we'll have to, but just head on over to gameofcrimespodcast.com. Our merch is over there, our mailing list, and our book list. So you're going to want to check this out. Follow us on social media at Game of Crimes on Twitter, at Game of Crimes Podcast on Facebook and the Instagram. But let me tell you, I could say it really fast, real fast 3 times. Where you got to be, where you got to be, where you got to be, Murph.
You got to come over and check us out on Patreon. We've got, just like we say every week, we've got a ton of content over there, probably as much as we have on the regular podcast. We get a little bit more into our personal opinions on certain things. We have some fun. We got Q&A. We've got the Can't Make Us Shit Up. We got 911. What's your emergency? We got bonus content.
Did you just say 991?
Probably.
Folks, call 911, please. But that's why they took it off from Murph's phone. He could find the 9. He couldn't find the 11.
Well, it's the 119 is what I was looking for. But I mean, we rate a movie every month, law enforcement related movie. So come over and just check us out, see what you think. If you don't like it, well, just stick with us. It's going to get better.
It gets better. And look, trust me, yeah, we just got some good stuff. We just released some stuff. Plus one of our major things that we did, basically 15 episodes, 16 hours of The Real DEA Narcos on The Real DEA Narcos Cali Edition. We just dropped episode number 5 today as we're recording this for our episode coming out on Monday. Plus, we just released our Q&A, as Murph said. So we got some good stuff. So folks, go check us out. Patreon.com/Game of Crimes. You can, we've got 3 different levels there. So just go on over patreon.com/Game of Crimes. You are going to enjoy it. I believe it. PayPal.com. Use our email, gameofcrimespodcast@gmail.com or paypal.me/Game of Crimes. Whatever it makes it easier for you to do a pause for the cause and just toss something over the fence and help support the show. Now, as always, we should have, again, always dramatic music with this. This is a disclaimer. We have a show about crime. We talk about bad people doing bad things and bad people doing bad things to good people. We take the story seriously, but what, Murph?
We never take ourselves serious. We want to have some fun on here with you. We talk about serious topics, but we're going to have some fun.
Yes, we are. And before we can have fun, we have to do, it's required by law now. We have to do our update. And guess what it's time for?
It's time for Small Town Police Blotter.
And the crowd goes wild.
All both of us.
So I got a couple interesting tweets. These ones actually come to us. They're not quite small towns, but I think the tweets they put out into the Twitterverse are funny. The first one comes from Steve, and it's called Regina Police.
Wow. What country is that in?
That's Canada.
All right. Those Canadians.
Regina Police.
They know how to have fun up there.
Yes, they do. And this one had an awful lot of comments and likes and retweets. It's just simple. They say, we always wonder how many of the incidents we investigate start with somebody yelling, YOLO, you only live once.
Is that true?
That's what they put out, man. I always wonder how many of the incidents we investigate started with somebody yelling YOLO.
Here we go. Hold my beer.
Hold my beer. That's what I was going to say. Hold my beer. Watch. Yeah, anytime a redneck says hold my beer, you know something's about to happen.
Oh, I tell you what, sounds like something might be on Small Town Murders.
Could be.
Friends and Jim and Jamie. James and Jimmy over there.
Hey, well, this one comes to us from the Greater Manchester Police in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Now, anytime you put out something on Twitter, you got to be careful because if you leave even an opening, people will just dive right into it and take it in a place you didn't want to go.
Yeah, they do.
So, 3:11 p.m., a 999 number. If that's if you're in the UK, you dial 911. In the United States, it's 911.
But what sequence do you call those numbers in? 999.
I'm going to let you figure it out. All right. Darwinism is going to solve a lot of your problems now. A 999 just in, a half-naked and rather large drunk man threatening to bite people in the village. Officers on their way. Now, they left that out there, and then a little bit later, because of a lot of the comments they got, they wrote back, they say, to clarify, we think it's the top half that's naked, so rather large refers to torso rather than anything bottom half.
You're exactly right. Because, I mean, you can see this on anywhere on social media. You put something out there, somebody's going to take a shot at it.
Had
if
to.
If he's naked on the lower part, what's he going to bite, I wonder?
Well, it just says he's half naked and rather large, threatening to bite people in the village. So,
it's just...
What do we say, kids? Don't do math.
Well, I mean, if that was in Regina, Canada, I mean...
Well, that wasn't in Regina.
Oh,
that was in the UK. Nice try, Murph. Nice try. You're conflating Reginas and torsos. So
I don't know what you're talking about.
So, hey, this next one, though, speaking of meth, they had a kind of a sense of humor. So they show pictures of a huge seizure sitting on the desk. You know, the interdiction officer's got a huge seizure, bunch of bags, look like kilo bags, numbered. And they show a black canine sitting there, you know, and it's a police canine. You see the badge around its neck. And so somebody being clever, say, police busted a meth lab using a meth lab. I know.
Wait a minute, I'm trying to get a laugh out here. Oh, Lord. That's why we're cops and not comedians, right?
That's right.
I tell you what,
it's a black lab, yes, but
some of the audiences that however I speak to, I throw a joke out there and you just hear crickets. And I'm like, guys, that's as funny as it's going to get here. It's going to be a long day if you.
That's funny right there. I don't care who you are. That's funny right there. Well, hey, let's finish up. We kind of had a visual thing, but here, let's finish up with this one though. This one is a real small town police blotter. Okay. 5:38 p.m. Steve, police were called to a report of a suspicious incident in the 2900 block of West Acres Drive, where a woman reported that she had found feces in her toilet she did not think she put there. There was no damage to the house and no other reason to believe someone had been inside the house. I took a dump and I don't remember.
I forgot to flush.
That's going to be one of those new commercials. I've taken a dump and I can't get up, you know.
It doesn't say the age of the complainant, does it?
No, but if you've taken... Here's a pro tip, folks. Don't use meth. If you've taken a dump and you can't remember you've taken a dump, you probably need to cut back.
It might be time to go to assisted living.
It might be, yes.
Hey, and you know what? And we're not making fun of it. I mean, it's just funny. You know, I'm probably on that way to... I can't even remember 199.
We would not even be remotely making fun of her if somebody didn't pick up the phone and call the police and say, I found a turd in my toilet. Well, that's where they're supposed to be,
that's
yes.
One way to put it, yep.
Yep, okay. Oh, my God. All right. Well, Kyrie Domine Danes Requiem.
Thank goodness.
Speaking of that, we just watched my middle child came over, my son. We watched Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and that's where it is. P.A.S. Domine Danes Requiem. Whack. So if you watch that, you guys get it, and it's just a flesh wound. So, hey, but let's set this one up, though, too. Hey, before we get into that, though, just guys, remember, too, we got another little thing, too. Go over to our Game of Crimes fans page, run by our favorite Mafia queen, Sandy Salvato. Just even get close, answer a couple questions. Just wing it. Just pretend that you know what you're talking about. Just throw some answers in there. Go join us. Just simple. Go to Facebook, type in Game of Crimes fans, take you to the page. That's where that's kind of the after party. That's where the good stuff goes on.
I tell you what, some of the folks on there come up with this funniest stuff. It's hilarious what you read on there. And then they kind of expound on it and it really gets funny.
It really gets funny. So make sure that it's really funny. So make sure that you're watching it. Yeah. Make sure that you go there and have fun with it. So,
there you go.
So let's talk this one. This is another Canadian. So this is we're rounding out our complement of Canadians that we have on here, and Mike Arntfield is kind of a unique character. So because of what we talked about, this is only going to be a 1 episode show, so we won't have a part 2. There's only be one part to this. But we talk about some real interesting stuff when we talk about his work that he's done in serial crimes, serial killers, helping develop an algorithm that has identified actually a serial killer. I believe in Indiana. They're also working on another one where they think they've linked 56, I think, or more homicides in Chicago to the same person. So this is really, and he's written a books. He's got a PhD now. He was in police work, worked on getting his PhD. So, Steve, I mean, this is one of those things. This is more cerebral. So this was tough for you.
I was just getting ready to say, you won't hear me talk a lot on this one. But this was, we were introduced to Mike by Steve Metelsky, who's been a former guest here on our show and has been very gracious in helping us to find some other Canadian police officers that we could bring on because we'd like to have our Canadian brothers and sisters on there. So thank you, Steve. I think that this became so technical. I've never been assigned to work murders. I've worked on murder cases and suicide cases, but I was never a lead officer or a lead detective on any of that stuff. And it takes, with the way that technology is changing now and additional investigative tools that might be in the investigator's toolbox, I was impressed with everything I heard. And you listeners, you won't hear me say this often. I was even impressed with Morgan. So,
have you been drinking again, Murph? You fall off the wagon?
No, this is very interesting because it talks about some complex issues that you won't. I don't think you're hearing about anywhere else.
Yeah, we kind of do a deep dive on some stuff, and this is stuff that I'm really fascinated about. Actually, it's helped me too. As we record this, the following day, I'm driving down to the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police conference. I'm meeting with three detectives on a cold case that I have helped them make a major breakthrough on. And so we're meeting to do a case review while we're down there. And hopefully we're going to get, we've got some work to do on it, but hopefully we're going to get some resolution and we will indict someone. And when we do, I will bring you reports of that. But that being said,
absolutely,
there's only one way, Steve, Murph, whatever you call it. All I know is that if you're in danger, just keep dialing digits until somebody says 911. What's your emergency?
199. Here we go.
keep dialing. All right. Hey, but there's only one way we can find out what Mike Arntfield has to say, and that's me asking you: are you ready to play the biggest, baddest, most complex, dangerous, and not under? I can't even say it anymore. The most dangerous game of all, Game of Crimes. Like that's my Derek Maltz invitation. Most dangerous game of all, Game of Crimes.
And just so you know, we're watching college football. It's Saturday, so I think he's been into that Belgian beer, if you know what I mean. But listen, everybody, this one is one that you haven't heard anything like it before on here. So get in, sit down, shut up, and hold on. Bring on Mr. Mike Arntfield.
All right. Amigos, amigas, players, playerettes, dudettes, everybody in between, as we say, welcome back. This is another fantastic episode. And we traveled back to the north, back to the north to find somebody. We've had such good luck with all of our Canadian guests. We know that this one will not disappoint if the pre-call is any indication. So Mike Arntfield, and did I pronounce that right? Is it Arntfield or Arntfeld?
Field.
Arntfield. All right.
You got it.
Just call him Mike.
Just call him Mike. We're going to call you Mike. Mike A. Mikey A. So, Mike A., welcome to Game of Crimes, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome,
good to
Mike.
be here.
Good. And a shout out to Steve Metelsky for making the introduction for us here.
Yeah.
That's right.
And speaking of Steve Metelsky, we used him. We interviewed a guy named Jack Garcia. That's going to be a podcast coming out. Jack worked undercover in the FBI to work on the Gambino crime family. They pulled the plug right before he was going to go through the ceremony and become a made man. That's how close. And then we were telling him about the one Stephen Metelsky showed us. He said, this is what it's really like. Two guys in a velour running suit telling the guy, yeah, wave your right hand. Okay, promise to do that. Okay, that's really good. Now let's go to the buffet. That was up there in Canada, up in Toronto, I think, in some Motel 6.
That's an expedited ceremony.
Yeah, totally ruined the mystique of it. But anyway, hey, no, Mike, this will be fun because you and I were talking a little bit beforehand. We've got somebody in common, Tom Hargrove, and the project that you have been working with, and I've been using some of your data too to do some work. So this is going to be fascinating. But as we do with everybody, and this thing we call this thing of ours, Cosa Nostra law enforcement, like how I work that in. Hey, let's set the groundwork. How did you get started in this field? What led you to it? Because you've written books. I mean, you've been involved. You've got your own podcast called Suspect Zero. You've written lots of articles, research. How did you get started in this? Were you just bored one day and decided, hey, I think I'll do this, or what?
Morgan, it's been a long, winding road. I was a teenager. Let's go way back, okay? And basically, three things coalesced that made me realize that I wanted to pursue law enforcement. So number one, and this is detailed in my book, Murder City, about the city where I grew up and its prevalence of serial killers, which people don't typically associate with, suburban Canada. But my research suggests that there was more in London, Ontario, Canada per capita than anywhere else in the world for about 30 years. And one of those killers struck in the neighborhood where I grew up and was never caught. And I walked the same path to school as one of the young boys that was targeted by this sicko. And the question always was, is he from the neighborhood? Is he still lurking around? So, I mean, that's the specter in which sort of I grew up. So that piqued my interest in crimes of the past and cold cases, just as a boy. Then second, my father was the district attorney for 20 years. So there's always files around the house. There's always cops coming to the house for beers after cases. So a window into sort of the fraternity of law enforcement through him. And then the third was my original career plan was to be a lead guitarist in a heavy metal band and to be a rock star. And my next door neighbor was a detective. And I had the amp cranked one day and was just like shredding solos. And he knocks on the door. And I thought he was coming to complain about the noise. And he says, "Can you teach me to play like that?" So I started giving this guy guitar lessons. And he was kind of an aspirational dude. Like he was in his 50s. He decides, I want to learn to play rock guitar. And he drove a cool car. He just seemed like a cool guy. And I thought, you know what? Like this lifestyle, he'd be home at like Tuesday at noon in the summer at the pool. And I thought, a job that offers that kind of diversity and excitement and also seemed to be a work-life balance and a lifestyle. I knew I wasn't cut out for 9 to 5, Monday to Friday stuff. So all of these things sort of came to be in my late teens. And I realized, this is what I wanted to do. And I was fortunately successful straight out of university at 21.
You were successful in what? Joining a heavy metal band and going out on the road, or something else?
Well,
easy top.
Strangely enough, shortly after getting on the job, as we say, so I started in uniform the same as everybody, for the most part, at least if you're in a city department. And there was a bunch of other guys who played instruments, and we started a band. I ended up leaving. The set list that they wanted didn't really square with what I liked playing.
Why? What, they were playing Andy Williams and what, Tennessee Ernie Ford, or no Metallica? I take it.
Yeah, no, none of that stuff. So it was just like, I think some Joan Jett's tunes would be as heavy as they got. So I thought, what, peace out. But
oh, that's weak, man. That's weak. I played in a band up until about 6 years ago. We were actually kind of the same thing. Got a collection of people in the criminal justice society and stuff. We called ourselves the Rolling Justice Review. What was your band name?
My original band name was Urban Decay, which was my main metal band growing up. This band, the Police Band, went through a number of names. Again, I was very briefly with them, but when I was with them, it was Last Hour, which was a terrible name. But what that means, and some cops listening might know what that means. Back in the day, if you basically skipped lunch or you worked through lunch because you were on guarding a scene or something like that, and you couldn't really take a lunch, you got what's called Last Hour, which basically your last hour off in lieu, and you got to leave early. So an obscure esoteric name that they later changed, but I guess the bottom line here is that I was right, and that people drawn to law enforcement, I quickly realized, come from a variety of backgrounds, but frequently have common interests that I don't think the public knows that cops do. I mean, no one would equate I think most police officers with, being music connoisseurs.
Well, and I've got a question for you about when your dad was the DA and cops were coming over, sitting around. I can't believe Canadian cops are drinking beer. Come on now, you got a standard.
I can't believe they're drinking beer after this case. Normally, it's during the case, before the case, while the case is going on.
Yeah, perhaps, but not at the trial. Yeah.
Did your cop buddies know that you were into heavy metal?
Oh yeah. And a lot of these guys again come from again diverse backgrounds, but I think certain things in common, which I'd like, from what I've seen, are mostly supportive parents, good families who provide the resources to either pursue music, pursue sports, pursue civic activities. And those are obviously the bedrock of the collective bedrock of, I think, what you would call sort of the police personality.
We all kind of have our I don't know if you call it a secret or not, but most people that know me think I'm kind of quiet and so forth. One of my favorite bands is Pitbull. I love that guy.
I can't believe that first one. I like Pitbull. Then he started jamming to Pitbull and rapping like Pitbull. I said, no, that just stop there. Stop.
That's going to be a whole new podcast. I'll probably do that solo.
Yeah, let's not. Hey, let's rewind a little bit, though, because I don't want to gloss over stuff. Your dad was the district attorney. You were growing up in London, Ontario, which I just pulled up the map here. So it is south and west of Toronto. And I had some friends on Toronto Police Services, OPP up north, all the way up in where Shania Twain is from. So he was in the South Porcupine Detachment for OPP, but
oh boy,
yeah. Way up there. And I've been there before too. Exciting. But hey, going back to that, when your dad was the district attorney, did he prosecute any of the serial cases that you were referring to?
Well, for your listeners, I use the term district attorney because that's what Americans know. Here we call it the Crown Attorney.
Right, the Crown. And
it's appointed, not elected, which has some issues depending on your jurisdiction. But no, he didn't, because a lot of these serial killers weren't caught. I mean, he prosecuted a number of he focused on prosecuting murder cases and had some really interesting ones. Exorcisms Gone Wrong, where the boy died. A guy who murdered his mother because his Dungeons and Dragons character did the same thing, and he had to emulate that. Some really interesting cases, but none of the serial ones that actually predated his tenure.
Now, did you sneak in as a Ute and look over his cases to see what was going on? Were you reading them instead of, Stephen King or other stuff during the day?
Well, I didn't need to read them because we would actively discuss them. I mean, and my friends in particular were just whose parents had comparatively, I think, boring jobs. I mean, good jobs, but I mean, this was all pre-true crime, pre-reality television. And I mean, to come over to my place and hear the stories, I mean, perhaps Cops Kids probably have better stories. But by the time these cases got to court, I mean, he got to pick and choose really the files that he was most interested in and which commanded that a thorough, relentless job be done. So, I mean, he had sort of the cream of the crop in terms of, I think, story-worthy cases.
Oh, as a teenager, I mean, that would be a hoot to go in and listen to somebody's dad like that.
Sit around a campfire and say, "Hey, forget that story. I got a case file. Let's read my case file here."
Oh, yeah.
Hey, well, let's talk about your glide path then, because that's what got you interested in it. But after high school, what did you do, and what was your glide path into law enforcement? How did that look?
So after high school, I went to university just for a 3-year anthropology archaeology degree, which I figured could get me in and out and would give me the degree sort of the police services in Canada at the time were really expecting, quite frankly, to have. I mean, it was by the time I was interested, a pretty sought after position. So that was one of the requirements. I knew I'd go back one day, but I really wanted to get out in my early 20s as fast as I could. So, my university experience initially was what you would call perfunctory, I guess.
What did you major in?
Anthropology, archaeology, which I mentioned actually in my TED talk, which is sort of I guess, ironic because I frequently, as I've done in my last book as well, compare cold case work to archaeological work. And then you sort of have to be one part detective, one part Indiana Jones as you unearth things from the past and interpret them through the lens of the present.
Yeah, Murph, you're on mute too. My turn to dog you. You're on mute, Murph.
Oh, sorry. What I'm saying is that's pretty cool, Mike. And did you anticipate utilizing that in your law enforcement career? Were you thinking ahead that far?
Yes and no. I mean, I figured it would be. I mean, most 3-year degrees, quite frankly, I mean, are to form your interest in something and to teach you how to learn, to teach you how to research. And it's funny, during my panel interview to get on the job, which of course is all senior officers, I think it was the deputy chief, and he says, quite sarcastically, "Are you here because they're not hiring archaeologists currently?" Which was sort of I think, a shot at my chosen major.
Or you should have told him, "Are you afraid I'm going to dig up your family when I go out there?" That's how old you are, dude.
Yeah, he was pretty old, but just a very dry sense of humor, as again most guys on the job by that age have. But then I knew, obviously, it was a general enough degree that I could spin it out into some graduate course of study that was more directly applicable once I'd banked some years on the job and then had the street cred.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, and Mike, we kind of missed an important point. Which department did you apply for?
Yeah, so I applied to 3 just to hedge my bets. So one was in London, Ontario. One was Ottawa, Ontario, which is the Canadian capital. One was Peel Region, which is just a massive sort of sprawling, largely suburban commercial area just west of Toronto that had a reputation sort of as a rough and tumble department that I already knew some people who had gotten on there. And London was the first to offer me a job. So, I mean, it was close to home. So that's the one I took.
How big of a department? And so, kind of give us the layout now, or some of the demographics and some of the information about London, Ontario. How big of a town is it? How big was your department? Kind of how big of an area did you guys cover?
Yeah, great question. So at the time, it was around 320,000 people. It's now about, metro, about 500,000. The department always prided itself on having the lowest cop to pop ratio in the country, which meant threadbare staffing. I mean, on many days, and it only had around, I think, 300 sworn officers for a city of that size. Now there's about 700 or 800 plus civilians, and they civilianize a lot of the duties as well. So more cops on the street, I think, at any given time. But yeah, the city then was chiefly white collar, middle class. As I mentioned, very few people knew that for 30 years, up until about the mid 80s, had more serial killers per capita than anywhere in at least North America, if not globally. And for the most part, a pretty conservative banking and insurance city that was really reluctant to change. I mean, we were one of the last departments, I think, in Canada, certainly in the province of Ontario, to move from the old powder blue shirts with the clip-on ties to a more tactical style black uniform with a dicky around the neck instead of a useless tie, and to move to outer vests. So because that was the look from the 60s that they wanted to preserve in perpetuity, and that was really the thinking of management at the time, which is in part why.
Well, that was the NYPD. The NYPD, remember, used to have those powder blue shirts because the theory was powder blue would make you more approachable to the public, makes you kindler, gentler.
That's right.
But what people forgot is its command presence. What's the first thing they notice about you? And if you look like you're a cupcake and a cream puff and a pushover, you're going to get, unfortunately, that's what's going to happen. You're going to get treated like that. So you've seen a lot of departments get away from that. And then, like you say, they've gone back to more. NYPD's uniform now is all blue. You see a lot of people change to different things. So I agree. Now, before we get past this too far, you've mentioned like 3 times now, London, Ontario was the capital of serial killers. You're not doing a whole lot for tourism for London, Ontario. So let's talk a little bit about, I know this is kind of jumping forward a little bit, but through your research and everything, Was there anything about the area that contributed? Like from the United States, it seemed to be Seattle was kind of like the epicenter of many serial killers. That between that and L.A. And what was it about London, you think, that Ontario, that created this confluence of people with similar aims?
Well, I float three theories in my book, Murder City, but I think the most prominent, you've already mentioned it when you talked about where London is situated. It is equidistant between Detroit, Michigan, and Toronto as Canada's largest city, and was really the first, I would say, middle-sized city. It was previously sort of walled off to have highway access, where people from either direction, as far west as Detroit, as far east as Toronto, could get to London and access its population of students and many young people very easily. And we already know the effect of the interstate on trends in serial homicide in the U.S. What we call the King's Highway system in Ontario predates the U.S. interstate network by about 5 years. So we were experiencing, the FBI has a task force focusing on interstate serial killers. We were experiencing that reality before they were even dropping blacktop to create the interstate system in the U.S.
Yeah, it was called the Highway Serial Killer Initiative, I believe.
That's
But
right.
that kind of reminds me too. Are you familiar with Kim Rossmo?
Yes, I met him briefly at Quantico, actually, a few years ago, where I was speaking with another member of the Murder Accountability Project. And obviously, comparisons are made because he was on the job for many years, got his PhD supervised by another, a very prominent, rigorous criminologist here in Canada named Eric Beauregard, who I've also met a couple times. And yeah, he's made quite a name for himself.
Well, and what I thought was interesting is some of this. I've talked with Kim a couple times. We looked at trying to do some stuff with him down here in Virginia, but when you started applying geographic profiling to we had episode, I think it was 13, was it, Steve? I think, but we had Dave Reichert. He was the lead investigator for the Green River killer case. And 49 homicides attributed to Gary Ridgway. Then they attributed, I think, another 4 more. But when they used the geographic profiling and they started looking at where it most likely looked like he was based around, there were 2 hot spots. One was his home, and one was the Kenworth dealer where he worked out of. And I just found that fascinating because it started putting in perspective how they operate. I kind of lay out that groundwork to say this: did you guys use? Was any of the geographic profiling used in the serial killer cases up there in London? Did you come up with any kind of heat map that showed you most likely where they were operating out of, or did London seem to be the place where the bodies showed up, or did that seem to be where they were operating from?
They were operating from there. The bodies frequently turned up in another jurisdiction, an OPP jurisdiction, which was part of the issue and part of how I ended up writing the book, because a single OPP detective inherited most of them when the bodies were dumped in his jurisdiction. So he left a lot of his files to his son, who then turned them over to me. And yes, we applied geographic profiling actually in an episode of an obscure true crime series that I hosted on Oprah Winfrey's network called To Catch a Killer. And the heat map aligned with the small town where we know the killer lived, and he was never caught. We know, certainly to a balance of probability, so a civil court standard, that it was no doubt him. And police have yet to go and knock on his door. Journalists have knocked on his door and gotten statements from him, ridiculous statements that I think are actually self-incriminating. But police just won't go near him. Don't get me started. It's just... that's part of why I wrote the book.
Yeah, we'll save that for later. But last question on that: is the guy still alive?
He is, and still, as far as I'm concerned, dangerous. As the research has shown, sadists, which he is, do not age out of their paraphilias and their predilections. They just find other ways as they get older and not as virile and strong to indulge them. But if the suffering and humiliation and pain of others excites you, that's not something that goes away as you get old and rickety.
Yeah, that's kind of a Dennis Rader
That's
BTK thing too. That's what he was.
Precisely.
pretty
Yeah,
good.
Yeah.
and actually, coming from Kansas, we're very familiar with the BTK case. Well, let's rewind a little bit because I wanted to kind of set the stage for that to talk about how you got into it. So, I mean, you're working the mean streets of London, Ontario, as a uniformed cop. How does that go? Once you get out of the academy and you get out of your field training program, what's it like being out on the streets? Is it what you thought it would be based upon the work that your dad did? Was it not as exciting? So, what was it like say, your first couple years on the street?
Yeah, tremendously exciting. I loved every minute of it. I mean, this was a day. Now I'm told by my friends still there that they're holding, 200 to 300 calls, urgent calls, in a queue at any given time. But back then, I mean, you had freedom to roam. You could, set up speed traps, which I mean, I always thought traffic stops are underrated in terms of, I mean, Mickey Mouse stops for a headlight. You'd be amazed, and you guys know this. What you can end up pulling out of that stop in terms of guns, drugs, wanted parties, prevent crimes that are in progress.
I got cash. I got over 200,000 in cash out of the trunk of a car for no taillights. That's the only reason I stopped him. So
Yeah,
there you
but
go, Murph.
you broke
Taillight chaser.
you broke the tail lights out yourself. You can't do that.
Hey, that's the details. Details. It was still reasonable suspicion,
Okay.
which is a we got to be precise here. You don't need probable cause to stop a car. You only need reasonable suspicion. You have to have probable cause to arrest. Their tail lights weren't working, Murph, and you know what? They had the money to fix it, and they chose not to. Not my problem. Back to and in our drinking game, I digress. That's drinking game number one. Back to our regularly scheduled podcast. But so yeah, you said that Murph and I both had that same look when you said now they're holding like 300 urgent calls
Oh
just
no.
queued up. I mean. What happened? I mean, people just get more violent in the area, more calls coming in, or is that just a function of just the bigger population and the? Do you have the appropriate number of officers in London right now to deal with it?
Well, there's never an appropriate number, regardless of I think the city that we're talking about. I mean, so from what I've seen, it's a confluence of factors. One is the population's exploded. It's one of the fastest growing cities in Canada. Two, like a lot of cities, it has just been ravaged by addiction and mental health and homelessness, which in turn leads the police to being, of course, the janitors of life, and every single social issue trickles down through other institutions to becoming a police problem, which obviously leads to a surge in people calling police for everything.
Amen.
And three, I think it's a combination of violence and society just getting more ruthless, but at the same time more entitled. I mean, by the time I left, the things that they would actually queue up to dispatch were just outrageous. And now, as I understand, they've removed. There used to be a sergeant in the comms center who would vet and screen what calls were dispatched and how many officers you would need, because they had the experience to make those calls. As a cost saving measure, they've removed an actual police officer from comms, so the civilians, many of whom are doing their best and absolutely flooded with calls, are essentially dispatching everything.
Unbelievable. You can't keep up with that. That's just outrageous.
So to save money, they cut a position, but they end up spending far more money in that and overtime to handle all the calls that were either overstaffed or. Anyway, I digress. Game number 3. So, but. Two. No, that was it 2? 3 if you're maybe I'm drinking too much and it's 3 already. So, but speaking of that, Mike, so you worked the street, but tell us about your transition from the street. What did you do? How long did you work the street before you had your next assignment, and what was that next assignment?
Yeah, so I worked the street for I think 3 years, and then at the time they had 1 year secondments to traffic, which again, a lot of people will scoff at, but that, I tell you, absolutely, that was a springboard, I think, for the rest of my career. The freedom that it afforded to just, go out and tour around, stop any car. And I mean, it was that really, and then obviously the investigations that go with it. I would handle all the major hit and run investigations. We would do collision reconstructions in the case of fatal accidents or serious injury accidents. So that really sort of allowed me to by my just mid-20s, dip my toe in sort of the world of specialized complex investigations. It's not just giving speeding tickets. So from there, I then went to a new experimental specialty unit, which was essentially, and we see this more and more now with other departments, but in uniform, but in an unmarked car, and picking and choosing the calls that you want to take. And then obviously that led to all kinds of interesting discoveries and stumbling across all kinds of things in progress. And from there, I went to the detective squad and moved through a variety of units. So burglary, robbery, auto and arson, which was a single combined unit, criminal intelligence, and homicide. And then went back to robbery, ended in robbery, and then went to basically a street crime / vice unit, although they wouldn't let us call it that. So we would do prostitution stings, drug stings, and deal with just a wide array of typically street crime as well as sort of, again, morality crime. And then from there, I was basically done my PhD and window shopping professorships, and ended my career then basically just in admin.
Being uniform in an unmarked car, that's almost like being a tactical squad position where you get to pick and choose. That's one of the best jobs on the street.
Oh yeah, cry havoc and let loose the dogs of war.
And these are not cars. I mean, you can see a lot of subdued or unmarked cars, and you're like, yeah, that's a cop car. These are like, one was an Oldsmobile Alero, if you remember that car. One was a Chevy Malibu, like an older model. Like they would look like that's some retiree on his way to a bowling league. And
I was going to say that's what Grandpa drives to the bowling alley at 1 o'clock.
Yeah, and then three of us would hop out in uniform and take them down.
So, but how long? So I don't want to gloss over a lot of stuff. So let's kind of book in this. So how long was your career on London, Ontario?
Just shy of 16 years. The last two corresponding or being concurrent with my then being a professor, initially on contract and then tenured.
So let's rewind a little bit, because you obviously can't keep a job in the police department. You keep moving from job to job. No, but that's great. I mean, you get all this stuff, but what we're going to talk about is a case in Chicago involving a serial killer that you helped work on that became a series on Discovery. But we have to have some background first, because how does all of this stuff factor in to, number one, let's talk about what your PhD was in, but number two, when did you start getting this research bug or this investigative bug to start looking at serial crimes?
Well, believe it or not, my interest in so I mentioned already the cold case that I was aware of as a kid. It was sort of a local boogeyman story that all of the kids knew of. But then once I got on the job in the late 90s, there was a cold case task force called Project Angel that was ongoing, that my dad, who was still the DA or the Crown at the time, was partially involved in. So I was aware of all these older cases, and then ultimately came to know one of the lead detectives on that pretty well. And so that interest was sort of always evolving. But my interest in serial crime came about sort of while doing my PhD dissertation, but then more so once I started teaching a course on serial killers at the university I'm at now, Western University, which dovetailed from a course I taught on policing. And one of the components, or one of the segments, was investigating serial crime. So I thought, this seemed to land really well. There was a lot of research and scholarship that I could draw on. I thought, so I proposed a whole course on that itself. And obviously in preparing for that is when I'm learning as I'm also developing the materials, and then ultimately become, someone at the forefront of scholarship on the topic.
So, your PhD, what was you? I love talking to folks that have they almost have a PhD, because they say ABD, all but dissertation. So they get pretty close. But what was your dissertation on? And tell us about the process of getting that PhD, because it's fascinating, because it's almost like going through your interview board again. It's like you have to go up there and defend it. There's a lot of things you have to do to prepare for it. So what was your PhD? What did you do your thesis on, I should say, and what was generally your degree in?
So my PhD dissertation was actually on police murders, and explored it. I mean, you really have to do it when you're doing a PhD dissertation, more so obviously than a master's dissertation, which is a massive milestone in its own right. But you're talking about a very deep dive. You're doing something that nobody else has done before. So I was looking at the systemic implications of police homicides within single departments. So this sort of, again, goes back to where I started in anthropology, archaeology, where one of the things that anthropologists and archaeologists do are what are called ethnographies, where they look at, again, the traditions and language and customs of specific cultures and groups and societies. And really, that's what I was doing with police forces, the difference being that I was looking at the aftermath, both the immediate aftermath and then the institutional legacy and storytelling legacy of police murders, mostly throughout the US, but obviously in some Canadian departments that had a disproportionate number, namely the RCMP, that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, that unfortunately have been involved in a number of police massacres, we could call them, and seem to be unwilling to adapt and change their officer safety strategies.
Well, I remember the one where 4 of them were killed. I think it was maybe 5 or 8 years ago. 4 RCMP officers were killed. And yeah, and it's just because that's what I wanted to clarify too. When we say police murders, we're talking about the homicide of law enforcement officers in the line of duty, right?
Correct.
So, yeah, and that's interesting because Canada has been relatively safe. I mean, compared to when we look at it compared to the United States, the number of officers that are lost. And, obviously I follow and you watch when an officer loses their life. But it's interesting the way that you approached it. What did you see the difference between the United States and Canada? Maybe one of the biggest differences in related to those police homicides. Was there anything that struck you as being, why haven't we discovered this before, or something along those lines?
Well, I mean, it's 1,000 pages worth of those observations, but I mean,
Okay, we
some
got
quick
time.
takeaways.
Bandwidth is free.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, there is still the memorialization of fallen officers in Canada, obviously, but what I would say is, and again, to go back to the RCMP, I mean, there's an example. The degree to which the fallen officers on American departments become part of the institutional fabric of that department, and the fact that there seems to be the memorialization doesn't seem to ebb or flag as the years go by. In fact, it almost seems to become something that galvanizes the department even more. I mean, when you just have to look at the online memorials that as time goes by, this becomes something people never forget. And so despite the fact that there are disproportionately more fallen or murdered law enforcement officers in the United States, including deaths by criminal negligence, not necessarily cop killings in the sense I think a lot of people think, but many officers, as you know, are killed by cars driving by them on the highway or in motorcycle accidents or what have you.
Accidents are the number one killer for a long time of law enforcement, followed by felonious assault. And then the one that they don't talk about enough, I think they're getting to, but suicide kills more cops each year than line of duty deaths.
And that is, I started looking at that, but this is how fast things change so I defended in 2011. And then, I mean, you just couldn't get people to talk about that. And or the idea that cops might also be afflicted with PTSD and need support groups, or that PTSD was real, or what they're now calling sanctuary trauma, which is a term coined by a Canadian scholar, which is the re-traumatization by your own agency and dismissing your what you've been through and what have you. I mean, I remember on the London police, this would be the early 2000s, a memo going out. It might not have been a memo, maybe it was just on a roll call. Basically, the officer in charge saying, officers found taking a personal day or a mental health day would be disciplined for feigning illness.
Yeah, hindsight's a miraculous thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
What a shame.
And now they're saying, if you don't come to work if you're having these thoughts, or take all the time you need. It's complete 180 from the fact you would not only be ridiculed, but disciplined, taken hours, taken days, taken for saying, you know what, I don't want to come to work. I don't feel like I should be doing this today. And it's no surprise, I think in London now, it's 1/4 of officers are non-deployable due to similar issues.
Wow. 1/4?
Yeah.
Wow. Now,
on leave or accommodated.
how much of that, I just want to poke the bear a little bit, but look, Murph and I, everybody's been through incidents, and there's things that, that really affect you. Everything from whether you're involved in shootings or you have a baby die in your arms while you're giving CPR, there's many things that affect you. So sometimes it's relative, but out of that quarter, I mean, is there a danger is that we're allowing too much coddling or too much flexibility in terms of how people define this? Is that just because of it's generational and it's cultural? I mean, the example I give is I just think of the military and I'm going, you can't yell at recruits anymore. You can't hurt their feelings. And I'm going, when I went through basic training in 1979, all of my drill sergeants were combat vets out of Vietnam. They had their combat infantry badge. We got yelled at all the time because it was a matter of life and death. They saw people die because people didn't have the requisite level of training they needed to survive in combat. So, I mean, what do you think? Is this just the phase we're going through? Is it a reflection of our culture or something else?
Yeah, I wish I had all the answers, but I mean, I think it's a combination of all of that. I know some people who are off who, and I've had friends in law enforcement take their own life. And I would deem them to be, resolute, resilient people. And I think it's just years of scar tissue and, again, sanctuary trauma that it just became too much. Now, at the same time, when you increase awareness of something, you're going to have people that gravitate to it. And I think departments have, again, as part of this 180 from you'll be charged with feigning illness if you take a mental health day, are now saying, there is, we're sort of like grief. There is no standard way to be traumatized. So while one person may be involved in a shooting, and that's their baseline traumatic event, as you mentioned, for somebody else, it could be witnessing something. It could be someone on their squad being shot at or killed. So the triggers are all over the place. And I mean, I've got some examples, I think, of people sort of really pushing it. And you wonder why they were drawn to this line of work to begin with, if their baseline is that low. But I'll refrain from mentioning those.
Well, and that's absolutely true, because everybody handles situations differently. We're all made up different. When I first returned to Atlanta as an assistant special agent in charge, one of my enforcement groups got in a shooting on an early Dark 30 raid. Had to kill a defendant because he was shooting at them with a .45. So 4 agents involved in the shooting. One, when I got to the scene, was visibly shaking. His hands were visibly shaking. He was upset that much. The other 2 guys were concerned, but they had control of their faculties. And then the 4th guy was sleeping in his cruiser when I got there. So and the nice thing about, I think, here in the U.S. is most agencies finally realized if you get in a shooting and your supervisor comes in and takes your gun and says, give me your gun, we need that for evidence, you're on desk duty. Well, now you just feel like, what the hell did I do wrong? I was defending myself, or I was defending someone else. And so specifically DEA has changed its policy, though, so that whoever's in charge of the site, the senior agent there, gets the shooters off site. Not that they're going home, they're just getting to a neutral site where local investigators or the press cannot ask them questions yet, give them the opportunity to psychologically get their shit back together. We eventually will take their weapons for investigative purposes, but not until we get another weapon on site to replace the one we're getting ready to take.
Steve, and that's exactly what happened to a partner of mine. That's one lesson they learned, is when you're involved in a shooting and they take your weapon away, you replace it so that you don't feel like you've done something wrong. And as a cop, United States and Canada, if you're there without a weapon in your holster, you feel naked. You feel like now you're vulnerable.
You feel defenseless. Then you're standing there wondering, what did I do wrong? This was all I did was protect myself, or I protected an innocent citizen. So I'm glad it's finally, I don't know, things are changing maybe for the better. I don't know.
Yeah. And that's the thing. So let's, this is getting pretty philosophical. We haven't had this kind of a philosophical discussion in a long time. And I think it's good because a lot of times we're discussing things, but it really leads into a lot of the work that we want to talk about that you were involved in, Mike. And let's talk a little bit too. Let's lay the groundwork for the Murder Accountability Project. Because that was very interesting about how it came about in 2010. It used to be a news service. I think it was EW Scripts, and then finding this interesting data, putting stuff together, and it's kind of blossomed from there. So kind of let's set the stage for that, because it's the data that comes from the Murder Accountability Project that allows us then to talk about the serial killer in Chicago, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So let's talk about the Murder Accountability Project.
I could talk about this all day long. So this is one of the most interesting things I've been involved in, and I'd like to think I've had an interesting career. So I was a visiting professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville while on a mini sabbatical from my home university at Western back in 2016, and was asked by a director at the Murder Accountability Project, which is based in Metro DC, essentially, if I wanted to join. They were looking to diversify their board of directors, and they wanted a Canadian who had a law enforcement background and B, advanced academic credentials. So I met Tom Hargrove, who was the founder and chairman, and this board, I mean, is an absolutely fascinating interdisciplinary array of people who believe 100% in what we are doing, and I'll break it down for your listeners. Most people, I think, believe that annual murder rates released by the Justice Department are pretty accurate. As the Murder Accountability Project determined, since uniform crime reporting, or the standardized, basically fixed choice menu of criteria that are forwarded by police departments to the FBI and the Justice Department for tabulation annually, that started in 1929. And it's not compulsory for municipal or state agencies or county agencies to do this. If you want FBI resources, you want their money, you want their training, you have to cooperate with the program. But about 40% of departments never did. So when they're publishing murder data every year, there's blind spots all over the country that they don't have the data for. So what the MAP, or the Murder Accountability Project, does is we collect the FBI's data, and we go department to department around the country, collecting through Freedom of Information requests the data never sent to the FBI, and we plug those holes. And what we've done is compile now a searchable list of murders with granular case level data going back to the 70s, and depending more recent cases from the 90s onward, we have better data. But now we have the real numbers of murder in America, and what we're doing is identifying trends in terms of who hasn't been reporting their data and why to the government. Who's doing the best job at solving murder, who's doing the worst, who's the best improved. And when I say who, I'm talking about individual departments and agencies. And then what we did is, because we had all this data, I mean, you can hunt and peck through it, searching by UCR category or Uniform Crime Report category. So you're doing research on people killed by being thrown out of windows over drug debts. I mean, so you're doing a pretty specific sort of criminological study. You can pull up those files by searching under those criteria. But we thought, rather than just selectively wade through this data, millions of data points, we trained a software algorithm to go looking for some specific patterns indicative of serial killers. So what the algorithm is based on a very simple principle. It scans these hundreds of thousands of murders that we have in our database, which are all publicly accessible at murderdata.org. And it looks for unsolved cases or unresolved or uncleared cases in cities and counties with female victims who where the cause of death is strangulation. And this is based in the notion, rooted in the idea, and in fact, the reality, that the vast majority of female strangulation murders are solved quickly because they're intimate partners. The female homicides where that is the cause of death have among the highest clearance rates. So when you see two or more in the same city and county clustering in space and time that are unsolved, this is two or more females who would seem have been strangled, which we know serial sex offenders enjoy doing, and it's sort of preferred MO, who appear to have been targeted by a stranger. So you have a stranger targeting strangers using an MO customary among serial sexual murders, and both, at least two of the crimes are unsolved. That to us indicates that you have a predictive or a presumptive serial pattern in that particular locale.
Hey, Mike, and let's kind of do something too, because a lot of people pretend to know a lot about this stuff and they get terminology wrong. And so I want to lay out too, because one of the things we saw was some of the, like we talked about BTK or the Green River Killer or other ones, there's their MO, their method of operation, but then there's also their signature. Their MO tends to change over time, mainly sometimes, but their signature tends to be constant, more often than not. Is that still what you found? And so talk to us the difference too about what the difference is and the importance is between understanding MO versus signature.
Great question. I teach this to my students really sort of the first week of classes. The MO or modus operandi or method of operating is essentially all of the ingredients that an offender knows or presumes he or she needs to successfully carry out their crime. And every offender has an MO. A shoplifter has an MO. A shoplifter may hit a certain type of store, may elect to wear a certain type of coat with concealed compartments. I mean, but those are decisions made before they walk out the door in terms of how they're going to operate. Killers, murderers are the same. They may have a preferred weapon. They may have a preferred hunting ground. They may have, like you mentioned, Raider already, a preferred attire that they get into for either counter-investigative or sort of tactical reasons. And you're right, this can change as the offender evolves. They may realize that bringing a gun is not the best idea because they're loud, and maybe sometimes a gun can't effectively control people the way they want. So they may swap out that weapon. But a signature, so an MO is what we call instrumental to the crime. It's all the ingredients that the offender, over the course of their criminal career, and this is why it's subject to change, will rely on to carry out their crime. But the signature is something more deep-seated. It's what we call not instrumental to the crime, but an expression of the crime. And this is something that offers no value added to the successful commission of an offense. This is something that has some emotional, psychological, or sexual symbolism and importance for the offender. So something that remains unchanging, because regardless of the weapon they choose, regardless of the time of day or location in which they strike, they will do this compulsively because this is ultimately an expression of whatever underlying fantasy or sort of identity that they have. So it could include taking a piece of living tissue, so fingernails or hair or skin even, which we would call a trophy, or taking souvenirs, so a driver's license, a piece of jewelry. That's not something that they're going to do here and there. We know that they tend to be very ritualistic about that because, again, that's what's driving them. And that's something they want to keep and look back on that will then inspire future crimes, in which they can get a lot of sort of fantasy mileage out of looking at this thing, handling it, and what have you. So this is why recognizing the signature in a serial case, rather than just zeroing in only on the MO, knowing that can change from crime to crime. This is really among the best tells that you're dealing with a serial offender, and someone who's not going to stop, because as soon as you see a signature, whether it be posing, again, taking souvenirs or trophies or what have you, this is, again, has a ritual dimension, and that ritual as the sort of word implies, is going to be repetitive and compulsive.
Yeah, because that's exactly the point I was going to make too. It's that the mistake is saying, well, because the MO is different, we're not dealing with the same person, as opposed to looking at the signature. Because to your point, the Golden State Killer changed his MO over time about how he broke into houses and what he did. But some of his particular signatures were making the husband lay down and putting dishes on their back or on his back. Raider had some of the things. They changed their MO, but that's exactly right. The signature is what ties them together, because that is the culmination of why they did what they did. That it's kind of like the reward for doing everything. And then you hit a great point too. They get these trophies because they also use them to relive that moment. Dennis Rader did that all the time. He would take pictures and pleasure himself to those and dress up and do things. It's fascinating. I mean, it's one of the areas I'm fascinated into, because there's so much to learn here. And I just get tired of seeing these people that come on TV that pretend to be experts about, well, I'm an expert on serial killers. I saw a lot of those during the DC sniper case and everything else. They were all wrong. All of them were all wrong. Well, we're setting the groundwork here. So let's talk a little bit more about the Murder Accountability Project. So you were talking about that. You kind of got this opportunity came up. So how long have you been involved with the project?
So it's 6 years now, and we do a number of things. We speak, and when I say we, typically Tom Hargrove, along with one of us, will accompany him. I went with the previous vice director, now deceased, Eric Witzig, who is ex-Metro DC homicide and ex-FBI, to a couple of talks. So the three of us went to some talks. So we lecture for law enforcement. We let them know about MAP as an investigative resource, not just the algorithm, but again, a lot of investigators will use our database to essentially either prove or disprove a hunch they have that an unsolved case is maybe that they're still working. Often a cold case involves a serial offender who struck elsewhere, and it may not turn up through our algorithm, which again zeroes in on specific cities and counties. But again, you can manually search by some really specific parameters in terms of cause of death, motive, age, gender of the victim, etc., such that if you have a really weird case, you can find those same essentially components of the MO and look for in other cities and states around the country.
Does this just focus on the U.S. or does it include Canada?
Just the U.S. I would need another 2-hour spot to talk about my experience in trying to get a MAP Canada off the ground in a country where freedom of information means absolutely nothing. And the government's hand-wringing obsession with individual privacy will outweigh the public interest, including stopping killers every day.
Well,
it's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? It's just, holy cow.
But it's Steve, but it goes back to that. It's a very cultural thing then, because it's like here, it's like FOIA requests and public records requests are stock and trade for journalists, for people doing research and everything else. In fact, Mike, you'd appreciate this. We had, I was telling you about this. We had Jack Garcia on yesterday. He was a Cuban-born. Lived there until he was 9 years old. Father escaped from the country, came to the United States, tried to get on the FBI, couldn't get on the first time because they said, hey, you're not a citizen yet. He got his citizenship in a year. He gets on. And then I come to find out a lot of the agents like him and stuff, maybe a couple years into the job, were filing FOIA requests on their own agency to find out what was said about them. And Jack found out is that they believed because he came out of Cuba, he was some kind of sleeper agent. But it's funny you mentioned FOIA, because here it's like, I can't imagine places where I just could not imagine in the United States not having open records and access to records, because that's just the way it's been for 200 years.
Well, and the trickle-down effect of that is a culture of absolute secrecy and misdirection among law enforcement in Canada as well, because they know, particularly the larger agencies like the RCMP, who are going through a public inquiry right now about their handling of a mass murder, and not unlike what's gone on in Uvalde, Texas. I mean, just complete disinformation being provided to the public. But nothing will change because no one can peek behind the curtain. For journalists file FOIA requests for information on this case, who knew what when, and it's a matter of operational secrecy. It interferes with, we've got now separate spin-off open investigations that might compromise. There's always going to be a reason, and so they know that, and they can just either not tell the public anything, or they can provide whatever propaganda that they want.
Well, some of the things that get out in the media now, I think, help to facilitate either the crime that's being discussed, in the point of giving that person their 15 minutes of fame, or they result in copycat crimes because somebody did get 15 minutes of fame. Would you agree with that?
I guess it depends on the crime. I mean, mass shooters are a whole other species of offender that I think we're really just coming to terms with. I mean, the traditional homes and homes typologies of mass murders, I think, still is pretty good. But there really is, we're seeing hybrids between, pseudo-commando and family annihilator, or disciple and ideological mass murder. And to the point that interdicting these people is becoming increasingly difficult, especially when, again, as you mentioned, the crimes are constantly in the news cycle, and people with half-baked ideas, maybe, I don't have the answers on that. What we do know is I think people overestimate the amount of conventional mainstream media consumed by would-be shooters. Most of these guys are doom scrolling on some specific website, and where they're getting their ideas, or commiserating and interacting with other like-minded people. They're not watching CNN at an airport and saying, when I get back, I'm going to outdo this guy. That's not, I think, where they're generating their interest, or where they're expecting to find their 15 minutes.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
So,
because you usually see where they've been on a blog, or they've been on some type of social media, even if it's the dark web, getting ideas, and even to a certain degree announcing their intentions. And Uvalde being, I guess, the latest example.
Yeah, the manifesto has become it's one of those red flags. But then the question is, in a sea of red flags, how do you pick out the one that's the most important one? How do you start tying this all together? And it's like, we're so over inundated. It's like the school shooting down in Florida that happened, Parkland. Tips were called into the FBI. They knew about this stuff. He had posted on Instagram that he was going to cut himself and do harm and things like that. So I think the social media has made it so much more complex than what it was. I know you're getting ready to say something, Mike. Let's do that. And then I want to start laying the groundwork for Chicago.
Yeah, no, we can just jump to Chicago. I was just going to mention, that the manifesto is really now, since Elliot Rodger, almost, to use your term, stock and trade. And I wrote a book on that called Murder in Plain English, that looked at how serial killers and mass murderers communicate and telegraph their intentions, as well as how they diarize their crimes, and not just through journaling or taunting letters, but the serial arsonist and mass murderer John Orr, who actually self-published a bunch of books where about a serial arsonist, and basically they were chronologies of his crimes, and he's the villain in his own book.
Yeah, somewhat of an autobiography. I think there was a lady, she was convicted of murder because she wrote about doing, I think, basically the same murder in a book. So it was kind of easy to tie to. So let's do this, because this is one of the early successes was Gary, Indiana. They found 14 homicides that were tied together, and they identified a suspect who led them through everything. So, it showed that this works. They've got a conviction on a guy out there, 14 of those. But let's talk about the process of looking at Chicago, because when you look at murders and everything else, Chicago's obviously a target-rich environment. No pun intended. Seriously, it's like there's obviously a lot of homicides, everything from gun violence to the other types. So, when did you start looking at Chicago, and what things started popping up that started telling you, hey, there's a there?
So there was a number of notable clusters that we identified pretty quickly. Again, Tom was the first to identify Gary, Indiana, the murders committed by Darren Dion Van there. But some other notable cities included Atlanta, Cleveland, and Chicago has the largest cluster with 51 strangulations since 2000. And so that's one that we found very compelling, and we and I say we, they're signed off and authored by Tom Hargrove, but letters go out to the chiefs of all these departments saying, hey, you may or may not be aware of this, but this is who we are. This is what our software has identified. This is, these are the law enforcement agencies we've worked with and where we've provided training and speaking. You may want to look into this. And Chicago was initially not receptive. There's a new chief of detectives there, Brendan Deanahan, who's very open-minded, very progressive, and knows that, there's something here. These are not 51 random strangulations, and in fact, there's patterns within that pattern in terms of there's a group of Latina females, there's a group of Black women. In one case, there's a double event in the same day. In many cases, the body's either left as is at the primary crime scene or moved to a dumpster or concealed and then set on fire. So you've got a number of consistencies in terms of MO, and I would say that the fire in an urban and built environment is probably more likely a signature than MO. If anything, you're attracting attention to the scene, and you're not going to destroy evidence. So there's a lot going on in there, and the jury's still out as to whether this is one or two offenders. But as you mentioned, Morgan, it was the focus of a number of news stories, but most recently the Discovery ID series, The Hunt for the Chicago Strangler.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, but I want to rewind too there, because for some reason, and we've seen this in many, many cases, we have to give a name to a serial killer. Somebody has to coin a phrase. First of all, it was the East Side rapist, the East Area rapist. The original Night Stalker, Iran. And then they coined Golden State Killer. And I think Dennis Rader coined it his own because he wrote that in this letter: bind them, torture them, kill them.
That's right.
What is the cultural reason that we feel we need to name serial killers?
Yes, so I've done some work on that. And really, we are humans, that is, are driven by stories. And particularly when you're dealing with something so odious and heinous and outrageous that I think most people cannot understand. They understand the nature of murder, but again, the psychological sort of underpinnings and the way that these offenders operate is really beyond sort of, I think, their moral understanding or what they're prepared to come to terms with. So by assigning these monikers to them, it's sort of name recognition. It becomes the currency through which these stories are told, and then it sort of cements them in this pantheon of villains, whereby this is how people come to terms with them. This is what this monster is called. The same as the ancients would have names for their gods and demigods and heroes and villains. Life is about heroes and villains and assigning names to them, and that's how we make sense of the world. So I don't think it's any more psychologically complex than that.
Well,
it seems to me like it's a journalist thing that they want to coin the phrase and then take credit for it. Get a little byline in there,
Certainly, that's journalists popularized it and sort of fomented interest in these people through those names because they make for great headlines. The evidence overwhelmingly points to Jack the Ripper being a concoction of the media. There's no question the murders happened, but them being all linked to a single offender with that name who wrote letters to the media. All the evidence points to that being a hoax.
The truth is too, it helps us as the readers and the voyeurs, I guess to a certain degree, it helps us to categorize because nowadays there's so many of them, it's hard to keep track of everybody.
And that's what I mean by the sort of, it becomes the currency through which comparisons are made. We've been doing it here today. We're all ex-law enforcement. We could come up with any any number of clinical or investigative terms for these guys, and we're talking BTK and Night Stalker and Golden State, and now Chicago Strangler.
Yeah, what we really ought to call them ASSAT 1, ASSAT 2, and just give a generic, it's like they name hurricanes. We ought to just come up with a name. But
Yeah.
here's what it reminds me of, though, too. Mike, did you come across some of this when you were talking that? I'm writing a couple thriller books right now. I've got a contract to write 2 of them. And I did a lot of studying, too, because I liked understanding the way books are written. Like you said, it's about story, did a lot of research. And Joseph Campbell was totally underrated. He was never appreciated until Star Wars came out. When you found out Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas used the hero's journey, the power of myth, the hero with 1,000 faces. He wrote about the compelling need for people. We are by nature storytellers. The human race is, and he looked at the way stories were told, and that's how he came up with the hero's journey. So if you watch the original Star Wars, that is absolutely Joseph Campbell, coming full circle. And I just think this is what, because the other thing too is I look at this professionally, like I'm interested, Murph's interested, you're interested professionally, but there's also this unnatural fascination with serial killers to where we listen to shows and, there are podcasts out there, which we're not one of. We do not profit off the misery of others. We don't sit here and talk about cases and get all breathless and drool because we're talking about a serial killer. It's like there's some reverence for them. Whereas when you talk to Dave Reichert and you talk about somebody who was there for 49 crime scenes, the carnage that was visited on their area and stuff, there is nothing fascinating about these guys. What is the fascination? A kind of a long way of leading to this question too, but what is the fascination with society with serial killers? Why is it that we make all of these stories about them? Why is it we write all these books about them? Why do we have all these series about them? And not just, I like the investigation discovery like you did, the more the documentary stuff. Let's talk about what's going on. But it's like how many times has Ted Bundy been redone into some kind of a series?
So I talk about this a lot in my latest book, where I look at the history of true crime, and I theorize it's existed essentially in 4 different waves since about the 1850s. And this current wave, actually, the last 2 waves, the third wave being in the 80s, which is really, again, where you see this sensationalization and celebritization of serial killers through those tacky magazine shows in the 90s, through Geraldo's specials and what have you. And I think
I'm sorry. Anytime you say Geraldo, all I think of is the name they called him, Horrendo Revolver, and then Al Capone's Vault. Nobody has been more wrong in the history of true crime than Horrendo Revolver.
That's true.
Yeah, it's
that's true.
That Al Capone's Vault, and then his original one was Murder in America, and this was the primetime interview with Charles Manson that really, I think, rebooted interest in the Manson case, and you could almost set your watch to that's where the third wave of true crime began, and this fascination with serial killers. And really, I think that fascination is a product of the storytelling platforms, where you have, again, these lurid tabloid series that would fixate not, again, on the investigative dimensions or on the voice of victims or the experience of the trauma endured by survivors and police and communities, but they just wanted to tell monster stories. I mean, it's the Universal Monsters series from the 30s on your television, and instead of Bride of Frankenstein, it's Eileen Wuornos or, like you said, Ted Bundy. And you're right. It's just disappointing that as first of all, for people creating content and producers and broadcasters, it's disappointing that there doesn't seem to be any intellectual curiosity beyond telling the same stories again. How many series on Bundy or Ramirez or Gacy can be made again? It's just, I guess they're trying to recycle the greatest hits for a new generation. I don't know.
And besides that, Ramirez had bad teeth. I mean, that's a turnoff for me right there. Hey, but I have a little point I want to make, because you mentioned Eileen Wuornos, and they were saying that she was the first female serial killer. I actually take exception with that, because the department I was at, Garden City, Kansas Police, there's a book been written about it. It's called Mommy's Little Angels. It's about Diana Lumbrera. And Diana's basically what she did was she would take out insurance policies on nieces or nephews. She would be watching them. She would bring them into the ER a couple days before saying, hey, they're sick, they're this, they're that. And then 2 days later, she'd bring them in and they'd be lifeless. And she did this when it happened in our town. Um, Dr. Eva Vaukel, she is the one who broke this open. She did a forensic. She did the autopsy. Actually, she did an examination of the eyes and saw basically what's the PT. When you get the broken petechiae in the eyes, it's indicative of smothering. And they did some more research. They found 4 more cases to where she had done the same thing. And so my question was, how was that not a serial crime? Here's a lady who did, she had a preferred method of operation. She had a signature. She had a cooling off period between them. And I'm going, how was that? She did 5 kids. They went back and they exhumed the bodies, did autopsies, 5 kids. And I'm going, how would that not be a serial crime?
Well, it is by definition, which is just 2 or more victims at different times and places. The U.S. code definition is 3, but that's largely administrative. That allows the FBI to get involved, or local law enforcement once they get to 3 to get the FBI involved. But the definition used by homicide scholars is 2, and you've just ticked all the boxes to make her qualify. And there's a known or suspected Black Widow serial poisoners going back to the 19th century. So no, she's not by any stretch the first female serial killer. Again, that's a sort of misnomer used to move books or to get eyeballs on the same old true crime shows.
Well, it's sensationalized. It's like, can looking at your dog kill you? Tune in at 10. Everything's always a tease with the most worst things that could happen to you. Well, let's talk about Chicago. So you started, and you made a distinction that I want to hone in on. The Murder Accountability Project is not an investigative resource. You guys are not guns for hire. You don't come in and do this. What you simply do is you look at the data, you find it, you understand it, you put it into context, and then the goal, right, is to get the agency involved. So let's first of all tell me if that's correct, and second of all, let's drill down a little bit more. I want to talk about Chicago, what that process has been like, because there's been ups and downs. I know when I had breakfast with Thomas, there were some ups, there were some downs of getting Chicago to actually believe that you guys are just a bunch of academics, or people who had bookworms, and you're coming in here to tell us we got murders, we got a serial murder.
Yeah, so we are absolutely nonpartisan. We have no political affiliations. We are not guns for hire. We do not actively investigate beyond identifying patterns and then turning over our findings to law enforcement. And for the most part, they are very receptive, because about half of us are former law enforcement, including, I already mentioned, the late Eric Witzig, who was one of the honchos of the VICAP program at the FBI. So, I mean, if there's a guy who knows patterns and MOs and signatures, it was him. But yeah, there's been some ups and downs in Chicago. As I mentioned, the current chief of detectives there is receptive. He appears in the series on ID. And quite frankly, we're glad after a few years that media attention is finally being paid to this, because for whatever reason, this isn't the leading crime story in Chicago. And as you mentioned, there's a dozen shootings every weekend. I mean, there's other things to distract, and I think that's precisely why within the department itself, 51 strangulations of females who were left outside, many of whom set on fire, goes undetected by its own investigators, because they're spread across 20 years and mixed and matched with hundreds of other murders every year.
That's pretty significant.
It's just staggering, the numbers, when you think about that. When you go through and you look, I think I pulled this. I think I pulled it off your site too. Some work that I'm doing with the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police. But when you look at the number of unsolved homicides in the United States, because I pulled that data right off the Murder Accountability Project, murderdata.org, for those of you who want to go look at it. It shows you the number of homicides, the number that have been solved, so you get an open. And homicide, they kind of went down. They're going back up now again, obviously. But the thing that concerns me is the rate of increase of the number of unsolved homicides. I mean, you compare that now, you draw a line that goes with it that shows the number of resources being dedicated to it. We're kind of at a critical point, though, aren't we, Mike, to where it's like we are now, with everything that's gone on socially, and we try and stay pretty much apolitical on the show, but people do talk about defund the police. People do talk about, hey, we want to take budget away and move it from here to there. There are implications anytime you don't solve cold cases, anytime you're unable to solve active cases, anytime you pull people off of investigative stuff to have them respond to these calls to service. Where do you think we're at right now? I want to drill down more on Chicago, but I kind of want to set the groundwork for that in terms of what's happening out there. Do you see it getting better anytime soon? Is it going to get worse, or are we at a very critical point right now?
We're absolutely at the most critical point. So 2016 had been the lowest clearance rate for homicides, or solved rate, if you will, in the history of the UCR program since 1929. Then it improved a little bit, and then 2020 was even lower. So that's the lowest in recorded history at just over 50%. So that's, I mean, some departments fare better, are still around 75, 80%. But overall, departments across the country have plummeting solved rates to the point that, nationally speaking, 1 in 2 killers, and we're not talking, to be clear here, we're not talking about offenders who are arrested and charges are dropped or they're acquitted. These are offenders who are never identified. So 1 in 2 killers never identified, much less actively investigated. So that is mind-boggling. And I mean, if it gets much worse, and in some cities it is worse. So you've got some cities that, are 30, 40% that are significant enough in number that then they drag down the entire national picture, despite some agencies still performing relatively well under very strenuous conditions out there right now. So, I mean, there needs to be a national conversation on this, because you're right. You pull resources, as I mentioned in my last book, and as I've mentioned before, frequently and sadly, cold case squads are seen, unfortunately, by bureaucrats as indulgences that can be done away with when it's time to cut costs, and unfortunately are among the first casualties when there's some pieces start getting taken off the board.
I've got a question for you about your method. So, and I'm looking at your website here on the Murder Accountability Project, and it looks like Tom Hargrove created this algorithm that you guys use based on information you get from the Uniform Crime Report, which is produced by the FBI, right? Is that right?
The Uniform Crime Report is the reporting system to the FBI, which again is voluntary, but the system is still used in some version by those agencies that don't report, because the data we get back from them has everything we're looking for.
So it amazes me that you guys are doing this and producing a very viable and useful product that could lead to solving some cold case murder cases, but the Bureau or other law enforcement agencies here in the United States haven't come to you and say, we love what you're doing. Can we get a copy of the algorithm? But then again, you guys, I see that might compartmentalize it to a degree that it's not useful to everybody, whereas you guys are looking at the U.S. as a whole. I mean, has anybody approached you guys and asked for something like that, or are they just going with what you give them?
They go with what we give them. They've asked us to run, for assistance, research assistance, and again, corroborating either a pattern they believe exists or that they think might exist. Remember, I mean, the FBI's got the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program that functions in a similar fashion, but I mean, they're looking at over 300 data points. The recipe for our algorithm is keep it simple. You don't need 300 data points. You need about 6 or 7 in order to, again, to cast the wide net. Now, are you going to get some false positive? Yes, and that's where researchers like myself then look at those clusters and say, okay, maybe this one isn't a strangulation. This one actually, as it turns out, was later cleared, and they just didn't update their record. So we delve into the clusters by, through, again, access to records to get names to go with the victims. What did they have in common? We don't have any information on the website with respect to the nature of the crime scene. So that's stuff that we can get either through police reports or media reports to either screen in that cluster as meriting investigation and will alert the agency of record, or we can screen it out as, again, a false positive.
Well, you got to love it. You're using one of the most basic principles in law enforcement, the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
And it's working.
I went through the original VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program training, and the original form, you needed a degree and 3 assistants to fill that thing out. And then they came out with a new improved form. And it wasn't, it was still like, you're killing me here. How much, I mean, look, it's done some good because one of the things it does, it can help tie some non-obvious things together, based upon the crime scene, the things that you find there. But going back to Chicago, though, Mike, let's explore this a little bit more. I go back to what was the receptivity of you guys going into Chicago? What did they feel about you guys coming in from the outside with your findings?
Well, Tom did most of sort of the legwork on that. And I mean, I have the paraphrase version is when he initially went to them with the data was there is no active unidentified serial killer in Chicago, period. And as we kept going back with improved data, and again, we began identifying some of the victims and confirming, again, through victimology, some commonalities, and then there being some natural administrative shuffling within the department, things just sort of align to the extent that now there is an active investigation into this. And I'm hopeful through some recent discussions I've had and what was publicly revealed in the series that an arrest is forthcoming, I would hope, within the next, 24 months.
Why has this been so complicated to get done? I mean, 24 months, is it just the lack of physical evidence? Is it the complexity of where all the bodies were? What is contributing to the time that it's taking to close in on this suspect and be able to file?
So this is one of the outstanding questions and we don't have an answer on this. And it could be because they don't know or they're not prepared to reveal, but 51 sexual strangulations and no DNA, which to me seems very strange. So there either is DNA that they're working. I'm being careful about what I can say publicly, or because again, this is an open question, or we're dealing with an offender who's deploying very effective forensic countermeasures and consistently so over 51, at least 51. We now suspect there are additional victims south of the city in the suburbs that have a similar MO. But at least 51 and to not leave any trace evidence to me seems very strange. So the answer lies in that question somehow.
Well, that's the thing is after 51, it's hard to keep consistent when you look at all of the others, whether, name the different killers and the different cases. There always seems to be some type of evidence left around. Now, the question, the issue was like in BTK is they had DNA, but they had no real way to test it. And the original lieutenant that was in charge of that did not want to burn up the DNA because they had nobody to compare it against because the methods weren't that good. They've gotten better. Same thing with the Golden State Killer. Same thing with Ridgway. There's always something left, and that's what boggles the imagination here right now. As I'm sitting here going, I can't believe is that there are 51, and you don't think that somebody doing this is exactly the type of crimes. I'm not saying that they're a Rhodes Scholar, but they're not exactly. They might be streetwise, but the ability to do that for 51s, I'm just sorry. I just like to your point, I'm not buying it. They're either not telling us, or this guy is the best, the most forensically sound criminal that is in his existence right now. Because 51 crimes is considering where it was all done, and there's no DNA.
Yeah, it doesn't wash. So, I mean, this is one of the many questions raised by this cluster. Again, never mind the police that are overwhelmed in that city with other crimes. You're telling me like local merchants, because the area we're dealing with is I mean, for a city of that size, not too extreme. At least many of them, including the double event I mentioned, are within a matter of blocks. So you're telling me like a local food vendor or someone hasn't picked up on the fact, hey, here's another body, like someone at the grassroots level in the city had to have said, hey, something's going on here, but no one seems to have taken notice. I mean, 51 essentially overlooked anonymous victims. I mean, it's a pretty, I think an indictment of that community, quite frankly.
But I'll tell you what it is too. We had an episode 60, Natasha Herzig. She was, growing up, family were Christian. She was a missionary, went to Jamaica. They did all sorts of great stuff. And long story short, is she gets kidnapped, gets kidnapped at gunpoint, is forced to engage in human trafficking, into prostitution. And then when she comes out, she's in the adult industry. Once she gets rescued, because she didn't know anything else. She had no worth. And the way she got treated by people, the comments I saw when they found out that, she was in the adult industry, without realizing the trauma she went through for 2 years, in terms of being trafficked, being forced by this guy to commit insane acts. And so I kind of bring that around to say this. That's the thing that kind of irritates me, is that we have lost the ability, I think, the empathy to say, I'm a big fan of Michael Connolly, read every Harry Bosch book, watched all the series, right? His statement is, and I think it ought to be the statement, either everybody counts or nobody counts. And I'm afraid that you get into some of these places and you don't count unless you're a certain socioeconomic demographic.
Yeah. So first of all, you can't be ex-LEO and not love everything produced by Michael Connolly. I mean, just philosophically, operationally, he nails it.
I want to be Harry Bosch. Yeah.
I pre-order all his books as soon as they're available. But yeah, you're right. And it seems to be increasingly that way. I've talked about this before, is people righteously demand diversity in their soft drink ads and sitcoms. But when it comes to crime stories, you're right. Unless it's the Murder in Paradise on Dateline, they're not interested. 51 women of color raped and murdered in Southside Chicago. That doesn't really register with them.
Kind of springboarding what you said. Look, Murph and I did a whole little Patreon episode on Gabby Taverdi about her kidnapping and everything. And somebody coined the phrase, and I think it was correct. It was blonde girl syndrome, because she was blonde, she was a girl, she was white, got a lot of attention. And which irritates me, because I'm thinking about all of these other homicides that deserve to be solved that don't get anywhere near the visibility, the awareness, the attention, because they don't fit into a nice little box and this is, I put this on the media, because if it bleeds, it leads, in the media. That's why Steve and I joke. Live PD, when it was on, pretty popular show, became the most popular show on A&E, and obviously it's on Reels now. But that's why there's no such thing as a show called Live FD. Nobody wants to watch a fire department sitting around in their easy chairs, eating their mac and cheese, watching the, Wheel of Fortune. People, I think, get addicted to this stuff, but the thing that kind of irritates me about Chicago is, with the murder rate they have, you think that they would want to solve 51 cases. Is it the syndrome of the king has no clothes, or is it more of not in my backyard? You go do your stuff, but don't come into my jurisdiction and tell me what to do. I mean, you can only put your head in the sand for so long, but the fact is 51 women are still dead.
Yeah. I mean, there really is no other, I'll use the term again, indictment of a city, its police force, its elected leaders, than to have a serial killer on the loose, and a serial killer you didn't even know about. So you can imagine why, and this is what we found in Gary, Indiana. They don't want to hear it, and because the narrative crumbles at that point. And really, it's the mark of integrity, I think, to say, hey, maybe we did get it wrong, and yet there is something going on beneath our noses, and thanks. And that's exactly what happened in Cleveland. They immediately were receptive, got the FBI involved, formed a task force, and then an arrest was made for one murder. a murder that matched the MO of many of the others in the pattern, and there's been none since. So we're confident that that was the offender.
Well, we're not into giving offenders airtime, so we don't need to know his name. People can search Al Gore's amazing internet if they want to find that stuff out. What is the current status of things right now in terms of? Um, you hit a very important point. Since the arrest, there have been no additional cases. What was kind of the rhythm of homicides that were happening? You had 30. I think it was. I was just looking here. By 2007, more than 30 women had been strangled, and then from 2007 until the arrest, there were another 21. So, what has kind of been the frequency in terms of these cases that are connected in Chicago? How often were they happening?
Sporadic, and that's why again we've now widened the net to look at the suburbs to the south, because the one thing they have, well, they have many things in common, but they're all near transit hubs. And the thought was that the offender is relying on public transportation, offending in close proximity to the stops, and then now is riding the L basically out of town or as far as it'll go on the line, and is offending there. And there's actually a Scandinavian study, a Dutch study just a couple of years ago that looked at the common characteristics of public sexual assault sites, including sexual homicide sites. And so there's a number of things that you would expect. So presence, open air drug markets, presence of graffiti, which is a good indicator of a neglected space. But one of the top things was public transit stops, because there's absolutely, it's the great equalizer. Anyone can get on a bus or a streetcar and encounter all walks of life there, including a preferred victim type. And really, there's no way to control that. And so it's not surprising that if you don't see offenses actually on the conveyance itself, it's going to occur nearby, where you've got, again, people waiting, people who are very vulnerable.
And that's very interesting too, because the Highway Serial Killer Initiative, when you look at some of the maps on that, a lot of those obviously are around interstates. But I was working with John Clark before he retired as the executive director of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And John used to be the head of the U.S. Marshals, the director of U.S. Marshals. But he had never seen a map before of all the long-term missing children. And when I put that map together for him, I said, here's this pulled from your cases. Here's it all plotted out. Mike, it almost had the same feel as the Highway Serial Killer map. In other words, so many of these missing kids were close to major interstates, major thoroughfares, along major transit hubs. And I think that's one of the things that's changed this type of crime is the availability of transportation. Bonnie and Clyde forever changed bank robbery and the jurisdiction of the FBI. Why? Because of the motor car, the vehicle. They could now cross state lines very easily. You had mobile criminals now. And I think this is one of the things that's complicated the investigations into some things, but things like this, where it's public transportation, you're finding these guys, it seems to me is that why aren't we focusing more on that? I guess I get the idea they're stretched for resources, but it seems to me when you've got things that are predictable and easy to rule in or rule out very quickly, why are we not spending more times, especially in large jurisdictions like New York, LA, Seattle, Dallas, places like that, ruling those things in and out quickly? Is it just people that don't want to be shown up, say, well, hey, you're coming in to tell us how we do our job? I, on the other hand, would be going, look, if we've got an unsolved murder and you can help me solve it, get your ass in here, sit down, and let's roll up our sleeves and get to work.
Yeah, and to be clear, most agencies, I think, have that approach now, where they are completely, they appreciate what we do, and this is why we do a lot of outreach and speak at, law enforcement conferences and network within law enforcement. But yeah, the NYPD realized years ago, that they needed their own transit police department. And I think I've recognized that the subway system there is its own city, or a city unto itself, its own ecosystem that requires its own police department. But smaller communities, you're right, whether they be bus terminals, whether they be I'm talking like a Greyhound terminal, which ironically is out of business in Canada now. Speaking of highways, whether it be like a transit bus terminal, a subway stop, what have you, they don't seem to, you're right, recognize that as a police priority. You may see security there or what have you, but you don't have the same type of presence recognizing that, you've got people coming into town that maybe you want to at least lay eyes on, or you got people leaving town who shouldn't be. And obviously crime just occurring in those places, and because that's what the data show, and there's no getting around that. And I mean, this is what they call evidence-based policing, and I've got a colleague who specializes in this, which is basically crunching numbers in terms of where, how, and what type of crime occurs. What types of places are what they call crime attractors versus crime generators, and providing the data to police so that they can deploy accordingly, rather than just saying, well, it's Friday night, let's just throw 100 cars on the streets and hope for the best. You can maybe use those resources with greater discretion.
Well, hopefully what we'll find out with this is that, like I said, they've made one arrest. Nothing has happened since then, but like you said, it was sporadic. So let's hope there's nothing else tied to this, because that's a good sign that you're on the right track. You got the right guy. But as with anything, it's a great story, like you say, but Investigation Discovery, and it's on Discovery Plus. They did a series about this. So Mike, tell us, how did this series with Discovery come about? Because this was just released last December.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the arrest was in Cleveland. There has not been an arrest in Chicago.
Oh,
so
okay.
I think we sort of conflated the two
Oh,
there.
I'm sorry. My mistake. All right. So no arrest in Chicago yet, but the arrest has been made in Cleveland.
That's right. So with respect to Chicago, there really, as I mentioned, had been very little in the way of conventional media coverage of these cases. And then I was approached, as was Tom Hargrove, by some producers who I think saw one of the paltry original stories, or somehow it landed on their radar, and then they were drawn to murderdata.org as basically the authority on the case, because aside from what's been in the media, we publish intermittent stories about our finds on the homepage. So they said, you know what, this story needs to be told as a tastefully done, proper procedural limited series. So essentially a mini series, self-contained, over several episodes. And they came to our respective cities and interviewed us and made some great progress in terms of narrowing down possible suspects and possible links, again, to other crimes. I would be doing it an injustice by trying to summarize it. It's an excellent series, and I think your listeners can check it out. And it needs to be told over, again, like 6 hours. But you'll see where they go with it, and I think I've really it's provided the momentum needed, again, to the point that I am now very optimistic. This has gone from, we don't have an active serial killer in the city of Chicago, to something that I think is now, well, we know it's fully acknowledged. The FBI are involved. There's a task force, and I think we're going to see a resolution.
Yeah, the thing is called The Hunt for the Chicago Strangler. Now, were you involved in the production of this? Were you guys like on-site advisors? What was your involvement with it beyond the initial discussion?
As I am on a couple of other series on ID, the talking head, basically. But in this case, rather than opining on cases I've no direct involvement in, I essentially bring the audience along and explain how the discovery was made, as does Tom, and then offer sort of the investigative and criminological analysis of the type of crime we're dealing with, the type of offender we're likely dealing with, and some of the other procedural questions that only a series, again, that devotes 6 hours to a case can offer.
Yeah, that's the thing too, is anytime you're talking about cases and they're reduced to sound bites on network television, that you're lucky if you get 3 minutes. You can't really dive into the details. And even made for TV, you get a 1 hour just special about it, doesn't really do it justice. So in terms of covering the case, how well did Discovery cover this case as far as you're concerned?
It's very thorough, and again, tastefully done. True crime, this latest wave of true crime, including on ID, has, I think, matured a lot. Producers recognize that audiences are smart. They are discerning. And yeah, not every series needs to be hokey and, nuns with guns or knives with wives or wives with knives. But yeah, this series, as well as another series I appeared on Discovery called Children of the Snow, which looked at another limited series, which looked at the Oakland County child killer case in the 70s. Those are two of, I think, I rank those as really sort of, I think, the best examples of the investigative value of properly executed true crime documentaries.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that because, yeah, for a while it was all of this really hokey stuff. And just like, I I don't want it to be so clinical and sterile that it's unexciting, but if you can make it informative and educational and really bring people inside the case to where they feel like they're on the front row with you, it kind of reminds me, it's like you sitting there with your dad as he's pulling out the case files and reading those. That's kind of the feel I want. I want to feel like I'm being on the inside, not like nuns with guns. I've never heard that before.
I don't think that's actually a series, but I mean, it would have
But
surprised you.
it's
Wives
gonna
with
be
knives.
now that you said it. Yeah.
I bet you that's been pitched. I can guarantee you someone has pitched that, just given the way how saturated the market is.
Nuns with guns, bank robberies pulled off by nuns with guns. There's a well, Steve and I both did an interview. I don't know if you got that back, Steve. I got my note back saying, "Well, we're looking for more somebody that's done stuff on hostage negotiation." And it's like, okay.
Yeah, they told us right off the bat, yeah, you guys probably aren't going to fit here, but we may use it for something in the future.
That's what I just got the note back today. And so it's like, but I like to see something fun. So, but let's talk about you now. Let's talk a little bit about this. What are you working on? Because I pulled up your page. I mean, we obviously don't have the time to read all your books, but we're going to put them on our site. So let's talk about, I mean, you're prolific. I mean, that's a big word for Murph. That means you do a lot. So
Bite me. That's a small word for you. Bite me.
So where do you find the time to do all this stuff?
Well, that's a good question. I just always, I mean, it's basic physics. An object at rest will tend to stay at rest. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. And I've just always been loved being busy. I mean, bear in mind, for many years, I mean, I'm working as a detective, working shifts, also teaching a course at the university, completing and defending a PhD. So, I mean, to have a book on the go, an article, a show, teach my classes. I mean, I've already established a certain bandwidth, and it's when you enjoy what you're doing, you find purpose and meaning and reward in what you're doing. And again, meeting fascinating people, it doesn't feel like work.
Well, you've got an extensive list here between your books, your articles, your journals, your essays and editorials. It's I put this in a Word document. I've got like a page and a half at the number 12 font. So there's a lot of stuff in here.
How up to date that is. My most recent book, just published a couple months ago, How to Solve a Cold Case and Everything Else You Wanted to Know About Catching Killers. The title's doesn't really do it justice, but I mean, it's going to be probably my last book for a bit. It really ties in everything we've been talking about today. Murder Accountability Project, the fact the murder rate is not what you think it was, the nature of serial offenders, the future of DNA and genomics, the history of true crime and its impact on actual crime and criminal investigations. It's sort of a tour de force of everything the true crime aficionado, I think, would be interested, including law enforcement, because I do fortunately get a lot of current and former law enforcement readers who email me with ideas or tips, including connections that they've made on cases after reading some of the more obscure cases I tend to write about, and then wondering if the offender I talk about is good for, again, the case that's still haunting them from years ago.
Well, I'm seeing that there's one underneath How to Solve a Cold Case called Practical Criminology, and it shows that that's forthcoming. Is that out yet?
No, I'm not sure what the status is on that. So that's completed and filed, and it's an academic book. So I'm at the mercy of the academic press now. So if and when they want to release that, but that's been done for some time. I should you reminded me, should probably follow up on that. I've been fixated on my other commercial trade press
I
books.
wrote this 4 years ago, people. Where's it at? Well, all of our reviewers keep dying. We got to, we're all aging out here.
That's a real thing. That is a real thing. I get approached to peer review articles that were written years ago because they just can't find people. And some of this stuff is pretty far afield from what I do, but I agree and say, yeah, you know what, like, out of fairness to just the process and the profession, this needs to keep moving. So I'll review it.
Hey, got a question for you. What's your familiarity with the Vidocq Society?
Limited. So I've read The Murder Room, which is sort of the official book on it. And I worked with, I was, I worked with a member as part of my last book, because I talked about a cold case in Pennsylvania. He's a Pennsylvania State Trooper, cold case investigator. Andrew Martin is his name. And so he's a member of Vidocq as well. So if I end up back that way, I intend on looking him up and hopefully going to sitting on one of their meetings. They do very interesting work, obviously.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I know some people who are members, and it seems like another very interesting society. Almost like the Masons, the Freemasons. We got to be careful because everybody thinks that's a secret society, and it's not that secret. I'm a member, but hey, so
which shows you they'll accept anybody.
Well, their service club insignia is on every town in America, so they're not that.
They're not that secret.
Welcome to fill in the blank. No,
to be one, ask one, as they say. Hey, but let's kind of close out with this and talk about. What for you? What would be the kind of the crowning, the thing that you would like to see happen during your time? I don't want to say crowning achievement. That sounds like, oh, there's just one thing, right? But what are 2 or 3 things you would love to see happen? Whether it's getting Canada, to reestablish, to come up with the real FOIA process. I mean, what are some big projects you're working on that you want to see happen, that's some change to happen, so that we can actually solve more cases, make more people accountable, be more effective with our resources?
Well, and I've mentioned this before, I would like to see complete, unabashed, wholesale investment, financial investment, but also political and operational investment in genomics or genealogical DNA. I mean, CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, as a legacy DNA technology, did wonders. But there are labs now that deal with degraded and limited samples that CODIS just can't go into CODIS, and that at the same time can identify bloodlines of offenders. And we've seen it used successfully, obviously, in the Golden State case, the murder of April Tinsley, which was an Indiana case, which for years really bothered me that was unsolved.
And that guy, Steve, I don't know if you're familiar with the case. This guy, this piece of shit, left he left vibrators, he left materials, he taunted people. And he was finally identified through forensic genealogy. They found a match, and then but to your point, though, I don't want to shortcut that. But to your point, it's not just the DNA. Even with the forensic genealogy, who do we have? We had Steve Smith, right, from Toronto. We're talking, one of his cases he solved was using that technique. But even that only gets you to a certain point. But at that point, you still got to have good old-fashioned detective work to track down leads, knock on doors, and talk to people, right?
Absolutely. It doesn't lead you directly to the suspect. You still have to then keep someone under surveillance to obtain cast-off DNA, or cut to the chase and get a DNA warrant, or exhume a body in some cases. And I think that's the case you're talking about from Toronto. That was one of Canada's most infamous cold cases, solved through genomics.
Well, the success that law enforcement has had with DNA, and it's not the smoking gun, but it is certainly a fantastic investigative lead, and it's resulted in getting people out of prison who were wrongly convicted. And I think you'll agree with us. We always say the last thing we want to do is put an innocent person in jail. So with those success stories already behind us, you would certainly think that the advancement of new generations of DNA evidence or investigative leads that come from it would just be automatically incorporated into whatever system you have. And I know this because I was a cop for 38 years. We're the last ones to catch up. The criminals, they adapt and overcome our investigative techniques much quicker than we adapt and overcome their new criminal advantages that they have on us. It just boggles your mind that that's not automatically done.
Well, and this is the role of the private sector now. And innovation will always come from the private sector, as you know, and then make its way to the public sector. You often last, unfortunately.
Yeah, Murph, the old joke was yesterday's technology tomorrow, and the government will solve just about everything. So that seemed to be our motto for a long time. Yeah, we'll use old 486 computers while everybody else has got these new things called Pentiums. But
no, we're still writing it out on legal pads and then letting some secretary type it up for us.
Well, Michael, that was the first one you said. More investment in that. What's another couple things you'd like to see come to pass in your lifetime?
Oh boy, got me on the spot. I would like to see. It won't happen, but sort of blue sky stuff would be a map Canada, because there's so many families and communities here that I think would benefit from it, and investigators I think who would benefit from it. But until a 180 occurs politically in this country, you're not going to see any buy-in from the agencies that hold all the cards and have all the money. They're the bank, and we're not talking just law enforcement here, but the custodians of these records at the federal level who just really don't care.
Yeah, and that's sad too, because when you look at between the U.S. and Canada, they call it I think it's the Highway of Tears. We've got the Missing and Murdered Indigenous project down here. Of all the unsolved cases that occur on Native American land, that indigenous land up in Canada, it's like you guys got to come together, because otherwise, what you do is you give a free hand for these people to go out and keep committing these crimes. When I was doing the research too, Native Americans and Native Alaskans were 2.1 times more likely to be a victim of homicide than any other race. And what does that tell you? It means they do it because they can get away with it, and the resources aren't there. So that's your point. I'd like to dissolve these barriers, these boundaries, and start looking at data holistically and say, let's pull it all together, because you and I know one of the ways that offenders have gotten away with this for so long, whether it's Chicago, they don't even have to, they can still be in the city of Chicago, but if they jump precincts and they go to a different place inside Cook County, or they go across state lines, or they go across the boundary lines, going back and forth between Canada is not that hard when you're in the Detroit area, the Niagara area, Seattle, Whatcom County up there. So I just like to see that dissolve. Final thoughts, in terms of anything else you'd like to see that happen, or hey, what's in your world? Would Canada have a single police force? Would everything be unified under the direction of you? Dr. Mike, Dr. Evil, would you be in charge of everything?
Yeah, you know what? That's a whole other conversation. I would. Policing up here is a mess. I go to these conferences in the U.S. and I have people genuinely ask me. They've heard of the RCMP. They may have had some indirect involvement on, say, a major drug case. But they say, like, what do they do? And I said, well, it depends on where in the country. If you're in, rural Saskatchewan, they're pulling you over for speeding in a marked car. The same, and you can imagine an FBI agent driving around giving out speeding tickets. On the East Coast, they're with Coast Guards operators in helicopters, or they're stationed at an embassy in Bermuda. And so I go through like the short list, and American LEOs will say like that's like 40 different federal agencies, and one police department is responsible for all of this. And we have most of the country is policed on contract policing. There's not the resources to have a local police force or even a county sheriff's department. So I would like to see a realignment of that, and conversations are already underway in that respect, where some municipalities and some provinces that have been done wrong by contract policing, where they have no say in who is brought in to police. It could be somebody brought in from the Arctic with no experience in a city. They pay for the service. They have no say in the policies, procedures, or who gets sent to their towns. So we're already seeing that shift a little bit, and I think you're going to have safer communities as a result. And I would like to see more of an American model I mean, American law enforcement isn't without its issues, but where, again, local government is provided with the resources necessary to hire local people and police locally, rather than have these, these massive state or federal and provincial organizations that just plug holes and have warm bodies and cruisers really not doing much else.
Wow. Well, there you go. Dr. Mike Arntfield, the new High Commissioner of all policing in the country of Canada. We're we're going to come up and visit you. But hey, no, look, this has been, I kid you on that, but this has been interesting. This has been probably one of the most philosophical discussions we've had, but deep dive into something like that. And I appreciate the work that you do. I personally get tired of seeing people that go on TV, pretend to be an expert on all things serial crimes, serial kill. They know everything. They get everything wrong, and but then the public sees that and they believe it. So I want to thank you for just, first of all, for your service to the country of Canada, for your service to the profession of law enforcement, and working on these hard cases like the serial killer cases, working with Thomas Hargrove down there, the Murder Accountability Project. You folks can go to Murder Data and see that. And if you want to go to Michael's site, you can go to Michael Arntfield, Arntfield, michaelarntfield.com. He's got a lot of stuff on there. And look, just thanks for hanging out with us for a couple hours and through a couple of our technical challenges and just getting you on and discussing these fun things. What do you think, Murph?
Yeah, and I just want to add, this is a perfect example when you take people who are willing to step outside the normal bounds of being a law enforcement officer and pursue their education to the nth degree, and then see an opportunity to expand the knowledge of others, especially college students who are, potentially looking at a career in criminal justice at whatever agency. But then the forward-thinking capabilities that you guys are exhibiting through this Murder Accountability Project, Mr. Hargrove coming up with an algorithm to track the information, which, I just wish that other agencies, there's got to be a way to get this information out to all law enforcement, especially detective bureaus, and state criminal investigation divisions, so that they could task you guys to find out what's going on with the cold cases in their area. Even in Loudoun County there, Morgan, where you're living, which I abandoned, the sheriff's office just hired
traitorous bastard. Yes.
just hired a retired DEA agent to come in and head up a cold case squad. So, it's something that we should never overlook. That's why murder doesn't have a statute of limitations. It's that important. To me, it's right there at the top of being the ultimate crime that can be committed, that you're taking another human being's life. So to echo a little bit of what Morgan just said there, my hat is off to you, brother. Thank you so much for what you're doing. Thank you for giving us your time today. Most of this was above my head, and I apologize for the background noise here. So I'm hoping Morgan can edit some of this crap out. But
I can edit you out completely, Murph. I just wipe out your entire track, and you can do that.
Mike, you probably just heard a noise that was like an annoying mosquito or a bumblebee there, and I'm sorry that comes across. We call that Morgan.
Yeah. Hey, but Mike, seriously, this is me saluting you, sir. Thank you for spending all your time with us. And stay safe in Canada, and be sure to come back. Let us know what's going on, especially when there's developments. In this case, is in Chicago and Cleveland.
Oh, absolutely, and thank you both for having me on. This has been a real treat. So, and thanks for the feedback, and thanks for what you do and giving a platform to LEOs, all of whom have, I think, a story to tell, and you're letting them tell that story. So, I'll keep listening, and I'd love to come back.
Absolutely, man. You and I are going to be doing some talking. So neither one of you guys go anywhere. We got some talking to do after this. Everybody else, you all stay tuned for the debrief. That was, again, one parter, but for that one part, man, we packed so much stuff in to those 2 hours, diving into these issues. And it's fascinating. So, he's done a lot of stuff with TV, with media, because sometimes I think it's an unhealthy fascination some people have with this, but it's very instructive to listen to what Mike's doing, the type of research he's working on, and some of the thing that I've been working on that I got a patent on. Him and I have been going back and forth a little bit. So maybe there'll be something in the future. Who knows?
Well, what I liked about this interview was I learned a ton of stuff, probably more than any interview we've done so far since we started Game of Crimes. Mike is obviously well read. He's up to date on the latest technologies out there. He's participating. He's such an expertise such an expert, and his expertise is called on around the world for the accomplishments he's made. So, and I think the public does like to hear about this, because I think it gives them a certain amount of comfort to know that, when these violent and vicious and the most heinous crimes happen, you got professionals like him who he's a retired cop. But he, just like we always say, just because you retire, doesn't mean that your oath expires. So proud to have Mike on the show here. He's showing us what he's still doing to help his fellow man. God bless you, brother. Glad to have you on the show.
Yeah, keep it up, and as we make some progress, we will bring reports of that progress. As I say in Canada, they don't say progress; they say progress.
Yeah,
back to you.
We're trying to teach them how to speak the
Queen's English. That's right. All right. So, hey guys. Well, again, we hope you enjoyed that. Again, like we said, one of the most in-depth, kind of very instructive episodes we've done. Just head on over now to Apple and Spotify. Hit those 5 stars. It's magic. We don't know how it works. It's David Blaine, David Copperfield, the Magic Kingdom, Disney, all rolled up in one. We just know it really helps us. Also, head on over to Game of Crimes podcast for more .com for more info about the show. We update as we go along. Check out the book page. All of Mike's books will be on there. You're going to have to scroll the page to get all of them. But just keep scrolling. It's all there.
That list, our book page is getting big.
Yeah, I think I counted up. We have like 26 or 28 books on there already.
Wow.
Yeah. And guys, these are all done. We don't pimp out anybody else's books. If the author or the person on our podcast is not the author or co-author, we don't put the book up there.
Yep.
So it's got to come from the source. So hey, also follow us on that thing we call social media at Game of Crimes on Twitter, at Game of Crimes Podcast on Facebook and the Instagram. PayPal.com. Use our email, gameofcrimespodcast@gmail.com, or paypal.me/gameofcrimes, whatever it makes it easier for you. And what makes it easy for Murph is when I say, hey, Murph, where you got to be, where do you got to be?
You got to get over on Patreon, everybody. Come over and check us out. Just check us out. Give us a shot. Come in at the entry level if you want to. See if you like what you hear, and then bump it on up there, because there's some stuff. There's a lot of funny stuff on there.
And I will tell you this, it starts off at $5 a month at our Evil is Coming level. You will get more content at that level than you get at other people's levels that are charging $10 and $15. I guarantee you.
There you go. And I tell you, we just recorded this week, our monthly Q&A, where our listeners send questions in to us. We have not turned down a single question yet. We haven't refused to ask a question. Some of them are fun. We've got one that has the rapid fire where you have to pick
Rick
different
Jacobson,
things.
man, he likes the rapid fire stuff, and we do it. It's fun.
I love it. And so come on over, check it out, listen to it. If you got questions for us, it's a great place to put the questions on, and then everybody can hear the answers.
That's right. So, hey, guys, do that. Patreon.com/Game of Crimes. That's Patreon.com/Game of Crimes. It's like, why do they repeat it 3 times? Because it takes 3 times to get it. Patreon.com/Game of Crimes. When you hear all those commercials and they repeat the number 3 times, there's magic to it. There's our magic. So, hey, guys.
And if you have an emergency, call 199.
911. 911. Don't listen to Murph. That's why Murph will still be sitting there as his house burns down. Go, where is everybody? I got information, but I couldn't get 911. Oh, 911. Oh, doggone it. Okay.
How do you spell that?
Yeah. Well, guys, we want to thank you once again for playing the biggest, baddest, most informative, and most dangerous game of all, the original unadulterated Canadian version this week of Game of Crimes.